The Mediterranean sun had barely risen over the Egyptian desert on the 4th of November 1942, when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel made the most difficult decision of his African campaign. Standing in his command post near El Alamein, dust still swirling from the latest British artillery barrage, the legendary Desert Fox surveyed the remnants of his once mighty Afrika Korps. His tanks, those fearsome Panzer IIIs and IVs that had terrorized the desert for 2 years, now numbered fewer than 30 operational machines. The fuel situation was desperate. His Italian allies were crumbling under Montgomery's relentless pressure. "We must withdraw," Rommel told his staff, his voice carrying the weight of a commander who knew the tide had turned. The Second Battle of El Alamein had broken his army's back. Despite Hitler's furious order to stand fast to the last man, Rommel chose preservation over pointless sacrifice. What followed was one of the most masterful retreats in military history, a 1,500-mile withdrawal across Libya that would culminate in Tunisia, where the fate of Axis power in Africa would finally be decided. As Rommel's battered columns streamed westward along the coastal road, dodging RAF fighter bombers and racing to stay ahead of Montgomery's pursuing 8th Army, neither side yet realized that Tunisia would become what German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels would later call Tunisgrad, a catastrophe to rival Stalingrad itself. The retreat was a nightmare of logistics. German and Italian vehicles, short on fuel, were abandoned by the roadside. Soldiers marched through scorching days and freezing nights, their Afrika Korps uniforms, once the symbol of invincibility, now tattered and dust-covered. But Rommel was not merely fleeing. Even in retreat, the Desert Fox retained his cunning. At each defensible position, Foucault, Mersa Matruh, the Halfaya Pass, he would turn and show his teeth, forcing Montgomery's advance guard to deploy for battle, buying precious time before slipping away again under cover of darkness. His rearguard actions were textbook examples of defensive warfare, inflicting casualties far exceeding what his diminished force should have been capable of achieving. By mid-November, as Rommel's forces crossed into Tunisia, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The Afrika Korps was no longer fighting alone in North Africa. 3 days after El Alamein, on the 8th of November 1942, the Allies had launched Operation Torch, landing 107,000 American and British troops in Morocco and Algeria. This second front meant that Axis forces in North Africa were now caught in a massive vice, with Montgomery pressing from the east and fresh Allied armies advancing from the west. The German High Command in Berlin reacted with characteristic decisiveness, though their decision would prove fatally flawed. Rather than evacuating North Africa and consolidating their defences in Europe, Hitler and his generals chose to reinforce Tunisia massively. They saw an opportunity. Tunisia's proximity to Sicily, only 120 miles across the Mediterranean, meant they could quickly ferry in troops and supplies. If they could hold Tunisia, they might keep the Mediterranean closed to Allied shipping for months, perhaps even turn the tables on the inexperienced Americans. Part 2. Operation Torch and the Race for Tunis. On the beaches of North Africa, the 8th of November 1942 dawned with an event that would reshape the war. Operation Torch, the first major American offensive in the European theatre, began with simultaneous landings at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. For many of the 35,000 American soldiers hitting the beaches, this was their first taste of combat. They came ashore expecting token resistance from Vichy French forces. Instead, they encountered a confused political and military situation that would cost valuable time the Germans would use to their advantage. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the US II Corps, embodied both the promise and problems of the American Army in 1942. His men were well-equipped, enthusiastic, but utterly green. As they pushed eastward from Algeria toward Tunisia, they moved with a confidence born of ignorance about what awaited them. The Western Desert veterans of the Afrika Korps would soon provide a brutal education. The British First Army, under Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, spearheaded the drive toward Tunis. Anderson, a dour Scotsman who had fought in World War I, understood the importance of speed. By November 15, his leading elements had crossed into Tunisia and were racing toward the capital. The port cities of Tunis and Bizerte were the prizes. Whoever controlled them would control the campaign's logistics. But the Germans had won the race. Transport planes and ships from Sicily had been landing at Tunis and Bizerte since November 9, bringing in the advance elements of what would become the 5th Panzer Army. Colonel General Walther Naring, rushed from the Eastern Front, took command of these forces with orders to hold Tunisia at all costs. By the end of November, 3 German divisions, including the formidable 10th Panzer Division with its new Tiger tanks, had arrived. The Italian Superga Division and elements of the Centauro Armoured Division added to the Axis strength. The first significant clash came on November 17 at Jebel Abiod, where British paratroopers and commandos encountered German paratroopers and Italian infantry. The fighting was fierce and confused, setting the pattern for the campaign. Unlike the open desert warfare both sides had known in Libya and Egypt, Tunisia's terrain was mountainous and broken, favouring the defender. The Atlas Mountains, running north-south through the country, created a series of passes and valleys that would become killing fields. The British push toward Tunis reached its high water mark on December 1, when tanks of the Blade Force, a fast-moving armoured column, actually reached within sight of Tunis itself. For a brief moment, it seemed the Allies might win the race after all, but the Germans counterattacked with typical efficiency. Stukas screamed down from Sicilian airfields, their distinctive sirens terrifying the green Allied troops. The 10th Panzer Division's tanks, including several of the massive 56-ton Tiger IS, mounting the dreaded 88mm gun, smashed into the extended British spearheads. The Battle of Tabourba, December 1–3, was a disaster for the Allies. The Germans destroyed over 130 Allied tanks and took 1,100 prisoners. The British were forced to retreat, and Anderson's first offensive ground to a halt in the mud and rain of the Tunisian winter. The weather, which both sides had underestimated, now became a crucial factor. Roads turned to quagmires, airfields became unusable, and the mechanized forces both sides depended on were reduced to a crawl. Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim arrived on December 8 to assume command of the newly designated 5th Panzer Army. A traditional Prussian officer, von Arnim was everything Rommel was not methodical by the book and sceptical of risks. The stage was set for not only a clash with the Allies, but also bitter disputes within the Axis command structure itself. Part 3. Winter Stalemate and the Kasserine Disaster. January 1943 found both sides exhausted and regrouping in the Tunisian mountains. The optimistic predictions of a quick victory had evaporated like morning mist in the desert Sunday. The front had stabilized along 2 mountain chains, the eastern and western dorsales, that ran roughly parallel through central Tunisia. Between them lay a broad valley, and whoever controlled the passes controlled the battlefield. The Allied forces were divided into 3 national sectors, an arrangement that would prove nearly catastrophic. In the north, Anderson's British First Army held the line toward Bizerte. In the centre, 2 newly arrived Free French divisions under General Louis-Marie Coeltz occupied the crucial mountain passes. In the south, Fredendall's U.S. 2 Corps was spread thin across a 70-mile front, trying to cover too much ground with too few troops. The Americans had spent the winter learning hard lessons. Their first encounters with German forces had been sobering. At Fade Pass on January 30, the 21st Panzer Division, newly transferred from Rommel's command to von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army, smashed into French positions. When Fredendall failed to send reinforcements quickly enough, the French were overrun. The Americans launched hasty counterattacks that were beaten off with heavy losses. Meanwhile, Rommel had finally completed his epic retreat from Egypt. On February 15, his rearguard crossed into Tunisia and occupied the Mareth Line, a series of pre-war French fortifications originally built to defend against Italian attacks from Libya. But Rommel was not content to simply defend. He saw an opportunity in the Allied dispositions and proposed a bold offensive that would drive through the American positions, capture the supply dumps at Tebessa, and potentially roll up the entire Allied line. What followed was the Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 19–24, 1943, a name that would live in infamy in American military history. The offensive began on February 14 with von Arnim's forces attacking through Fayed Pass. The green American troops of the 1st Armored Division were caught completely off guard. German tactics, honed through years of combat, proved devastatingly effective. Panzer IVs and the new Tiger tanks crashed through American positions, while Stuka dive bombers created panic in the rear areas. Major General Lloyd Fredendall's command failures compounded the tactical disaster. He had dispersed his forces in penny packets across the front, making it impossible for units to support each other. His headquarters, located 70 miles behind the front in an elaborate underground bunker that required an entire engineer company to construct, became a symbol of his disconnection from the battle. He issued contradictory orders, blamed subordinates for failures, and seemed paralyzed by the speed of the German advance. On February 19, Rommel himself arrived at Kasserine Pass to take personal command of the assault. Captain Alfred Ingemar Berndt, one of Rommel's aides, later recalled the field marshal's effect on the troops. The men knew the Desert Fox was with them. You could see their backs straighten, their pace quicken. Even exhausted as they were, they found new energy. The narrow gorge of Kasserine Pass, defended by elements of the U.S. 26th Infantry Division and the 19th Engineer Regiment, became a death trap. The Americans had laid hasty minefields and dug foxholes, but they were no match for the concentrated power of the Afrika Korps veterans. German infantry infiltrated the high ground on either side of the pass, while tanks and assault guns blasted through the center. The American defense crumbled. "They're murdering us," one American soldier cried as he fled past a command post. The retreat quickly became a rout. American vehicles clogged the narrow mountain roads, abandoned equipment littered the battlefield, and unit cohesion completely broke down. The Germans advanced 50 miles, destroying over 180 American tanks, capturing 2,400 prisoners, and inflicting 6,000 casualties. Yet even in victory, problems plagued the Axis offensive. Rommel and von Arnim despised each other, and their mutual antagonism prevented effective cooperation. The Italian High Command in Rome issued conflicting orders. Most crucially, Rommel was denied permission to exploit his breakthrough fully. Instead of driving on Tebessa as he wished, he was ordered to turn north toward Thala and Spiba, dissipating his forces' striking power. By February 22, Allied reinforcements had arrived, including British Guards units rushed south, and American artillery battalions that fired with devastating effect. The narrow valleys that had aided the German attack now worked against them, channeling their forces into kill zones. Faced with stiffening resistance and extended supply lines, Rommel ordered a withdrawal on February 23. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was over. Part 4. The tide turns. The aftermath of Kasserine Pass marked a crucial turning point, though not in the way Rommel had intended. The tactical victory had strategic consequences that would ultimately doom the Axis cause in Africa. While German propaganda trumpeted the triumph and Rommel's staff celebrated their success against the Americans, changes were already underway that would transform the Allied forces from humiliated beginners into a formidable military machine. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, acted decisively. Lloyd Fredendall was relieved of command and sent home in disgrace, replaced by a commander whose name would become legendary, Major General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton arrived at II Corps headquarters on the 6th of March, 1943, like a whirlwind. Within hours, he had instituted new regulations requiring ties and helmets at all times, restored discipline, and most importantly, restored pride. Each time a soldier knotted his necktie, threaded his leggings, and buckled on his heavy steel helmet, observed Omar Bradley, now Patton's deputy, he was forcibly reminded that the pre-Kasserine days had ended and that a tough new era had begun. The transformation was remarkable. American units began intensive training in combined arms tactics. Artillery coordination improved dramatically. The Americans developed techniques for massing fires that would become their signature for the rest of the war. Air-ground cooperation, virtually non-existent before Kasserine, was revolutionized. Most importantly, the easygoing, casual attitude that had characterized the peacetime army was replaced by hard professionalism. Meanwhile, the strategic situation was shifting decisively against the Axis. Montgomery's Eighth Army had reached the Mareth Line and was preparing for a major offensive. The Allied air forces, operating from captured airfields in Libya and Algeria, were gaining superiority over the Luftwaffe. Most critically, ultra-intelligence intercepts revealed the desperate Axis supply situation. Malta-based submarines and aircraft were sinking a catastrophic percentage of supply ships crossing from Sicily. The numbers told the story. Between November 1942 and January 1943, the Axis had managed to ferry 243,000 men and 856,000 tons of supplies to Tunisia. But by March, the rate had slowed to a trickle. Fuel was so short that German tanks were limited to minimal movement. Ammunition had to be rationed. Food supplies dwindled to the point where German soldiers were on reduced rations. Rommel, ill with jaundice and exhausted from 3 years of desert warfare, made one last attempt to regain the initiative. On March 6, he launched Operation Capri against Montgomery's positions at Medellin, hoping to disrupt British preparations for assaulting the Mareth Line. It was a disaster. Montgomery, warned by ultra-intercepts, had prepared a trap. His anti-tank guns, perfectly positioned and camouflaged, destroyed 52 German tanks while suffering minimal losses. It was Rommel's last battle in Africa. On March 9, he left Tunisia on sick leave, never to return. His successor, Italian General Giovanni Messe, inherited an impossible situation. The Battle of Mareth Line, March 20–28, demonstrated how much the Allies had learned. Montgomery's frontal assault was combined with a brilliant flanking movement by the New Zealand Corps through the seemingly impassable Tabaga Gap. When the frontal attack stalled, Montgomery smoothly shifted his weight to support the flanking force, the kind of flexibility he had rarely shown before. The Mareth Line cracked, then broke. The Axis forces retreated northward, compressed into an ever smaller pocket. Patton's rejuvenated II Corps struck from the west. At El Guettar on March 23, American infantry and armor stopped a German counterattack cold, destroying 30 tanks and proving that American soldiers, properly led and equipped, could match the Wehrmacht. The improvement in American performance was so marked that even the Germans noticed. A captured German report noted, "The Americans have learned astonishingly fast. They no longer run away when we attack." Part 5. The Noose Titans. April 1943 brought spring to Tunisia, and with it came the unmistakable signs of impending Axis collapse. The Allied armies, now under the unified command of General Harold Alexander's 18th Army Group, were closing in from all sides. In the north, Anderson's First Army prepared for the final push toward Bizerte. From the east, Montgomery's 8th Army, having broken through at Mareth and Gabes, was driving up the coastal plain. From the west, Patton's II Corps, before he left to prepare for the invasion of Sicily, handing over to Omar Bradley, was pushing through the mountain passes. The Axis forces, now unified under von Arnim's command as Army Group Africa, were compressed into a bridgehead roughly 100 miles wide and 50 miles deep around Tunis and Bizerte. They still numbered nearly 250,000 men, but they were a shadow of their former strength. Fuel was so scarce that vehicles were being drawn by horses and mules. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in African skies, could barely maintain 100 operational aircraft against over 3,000 Allied planes. The hill battles of April were among the most bitter of the campaign. At Takruna, a rocky pinnacle dominating the coastal plain, the 28th, Maori, Battalion of the New Zealand Division, scaled seemingly impossible heights under fire to seize the summit. Sergeant Han Manahi led a handful of men in a desperate defense against German counterattacks, holding the vital position through a hellish night of close-quarter combat. The American 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, faced its own cavalry at Hill 609, called by the Arabs Jebel Tahent. This 2,000-foot mountain dominated the approach to Bizerte, and the Germans had turned it into a fortress. For 5 days, April 27 to May 1, American infantry climbed the slopes under murderous fire. Artillery and air support gradually reduced the German positions. When the Americans finally took the summit, they could see Bizerte in the distance, and with it, the end of the campaign. The final offensive, Operation Vulcan, began on April 22. Alexander had learned from the mistakes of the winter. Instead of dispersed attacks along the entire front, he concentrated massive force at key points. The British First Army would deliver the main blow through the Medjerda Valley straight toward Tunis. The artillery preparation was overwhelming, over 400 guns on a 2-mile front, a concentration exceeding anything seen in Africa before. The German resistance was fierce but futile. Tiger tanks fought to the last round. Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, defended every ridge and wadi. Italian units, often dismissed by historians, fought with desperate courage, the Spezia division holding its positions until literally overrun. But weight of numbers, command of the air, and abundance of supplies made the outcome inevitable. Hans von Luck, commanding a Kampfgruppe in the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote, "We knew it was the end. No fuel for the tanks, no ammunition for the guns, no food for the men. But we were soldiers. We would fight until ordered to stop." On May 6, the final assault began. British armour, supported by massive artillery and air bombardment, broke through the last defensive line in the Medjerda Valley. The 11th Hussars, which had fired the first British shots in the Desert War back in 1940, had the honour of being first into Tunis. They entered the city at 3:30 p.m. on May 7 to find the streets filled with cheering crowds. The same day, Bradley's II Corps captured Bizerte after bitter street fighting. Part 6. The final collapse. The speed of the final collapse surprised even the Allies. With Tunis and Bizerte fallen, the Axis forces disintegrated. Units that had fought magnificently for months suddenly lost cohesion. The roads of the Cap Bon Peninsula, the last Axis stronghold, were clogged with retreating vehicles and marching columns. Some German commanders attempted to organize a last stand, hoping to hold out long enough for an evacuation by sea. But there would be no Dunkirk for Army Group Africa. Allied naval and air superiority made any large-scale evacuation impossible. Colonel General von Arnim, commanding from a bunker near Tunis, faced an impossible decision. Hitler had ordered no surrender, but continuing resistance would only mean pointless slaughter. Individual unit commanders began negotiating local surrenders. The Italian General Messer, commanding the remnants of Rommel's old army, sent envoys to Montgomery on May 12. The Desert War, which had swung back and forth across thousands of miles, was ending not with a bang but with exhausted men laying down their arms. The surrender scenes were surreal. At Cap Bon, entire German divisions marched into captivity in perfect formation, their officers still saluting. An American sergeant, watching thousands of Africa Corps veterans file past, remarked, "A few months ago, these guys had us running at Kasserine. Now look at them." The 21st Panzer Division, which had fought from the first day of the African campaign, surrendered with just 7 operational tanks. The 90th Light Division, Rommel's favourite, had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 men from its original 15,000. Von Arnim himself was captured on May 12, found in his headquarters by British troops. Unlike Rommel, who had been flown out on Hitler's orders, von Arnim had stayed with his men to the end. "I am a Prussian officer," he told his captors. "I could not abandon my soldiers." His surrender effectively ended organised resistance, though some isolated units held out for another day. The scale of the Axis defeat was staggering. The official count of prisoners reached 275,000, though some estimates put it higher, more than 100,000 Germans, 90,000 Italians, and various French colonial troops who had fought for Vichy. Among them were some of Germany's finest units, the 10th, 15th, and 21st Panzer Divisions, the Hermann Göring Division, the Fallschirmjäger Brigade Ramke. 23 Axis generals fell into Allied hands. The material losses were equally catastrophic. Over 1,000 tanks, 2,000 guns, 70,000 vehicles, and vast quantities of supplies that Germany and Italy could ill afford to lose. The Luftwaffe alone lost over 2,400 aircraft in the Mediterranean theatre during the 6 months of the campaign, losses in pilots and machines that would be sorely felt when the Allies invaded Italy and France. On the 13th of May 1943, Alexander sent a simple message to Churchill. "Sir, it is my duty to report that the Tunisian campaign is over. All enemy resistance has ceased. We are masters of the North African shores." A victory parade was held in Tunis on May 20. Units from all the Allied forces, British, American, French, even a Greek contingent marched past as bands played and generals took the salute. For the Americans especially, it was a moment of pride and vindication. The army that had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass just 3 months earlier now marched as victors. The Tunisia campaign's significance extended far beyond the immediate military victory. For the Americans, it had been a crucial learning experience. Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, Mark Clark, the commanders who would lead the invasion of Europe, had all been tested and tempered in Tunisia. The U.S. Army had learned combined arms tactics, the importance of air-ground cooperation, and the need for aggressive leadership. The painful lessons of Kasserine Pass had been transformed into the beginnings of military excellence. For the British, Tunisia represented the final victory in a campaign that had begun in 1940. The Eighth Army, which had chased Rommel across half a continent, could finally rest. Montgomery, despite his critics, had proven himself a general capable of winning decisive victories. The British Army had developed tactics and techniques in Africa that would serve them well in Italy and northwest Europe. The strategic implications were enormous. The Mediterranean was now open to Allied shipping, saving millions of tons of shipping capacity previously needed for the long route around Africa. Sicily and Italy lay exposed to invasion. Perhaps most importantly, 250,000 veteran Axis troops were now prisoners rather than defending European beaches. Hitler had gambled on holding North Africa and lost catastrophically. Goebbels was right to compare it to Stalingrad. It was a defeat from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover. The cream of the Afrika Korps, the units that had made Rommel famous, were gone. Italy, having lost its African empire and much of its army, was wavering in its commitment to the Axis cause. For the Allies, Tunisia had proven that the coalition could work. Despite national rivalries, command disputes, and differing military traditions, British, American, and French forces had learned to fight together effectively. The model developed in Tunisia, unified command, combined arms tactics, overwhelming material superiority, would be refined and repeated in Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Normandy. Legacy of the Tunisia campaign. The Tunisia campaign left indelible marks on all who participated. Veterans would remember the harsh beauty of the North African landscape, the snow-capped peaks of the Atlas Mountains, the salt lakes shimmering in the desert heat, the ancient Roman ruins that reminded them they were not the first armies to fight for this land. They would remember the extremes of weather, from freezing mountain nights to scorching valley days. Most of all, they would remember the intensity of combat in terrain that offered little mercy to either side. The campaign had lasted 6 months and cost the Allies approximately 76,000 casualties. British and Commonwealth forces suffered 35,000, Americans 18,500, and French 16,000. But they had inflicted far greater damage on the Axis beyond the 275,000 prisoners. An estimated 170,000 to 180,000 Axis soldiers had been killed or wounded during the fighting. It was a price Germany and Italy could not afford. The veterans of Tunisia would go on to fight in Sicily, Italy, and France. The American divisions blooded at Kasserine and tempered in the final victory would form the core of Bradley's armies in northwest Europe. The British divisions would fight their way up the Italian peninsula in some of the war's most grueling combat. The Free French forces, having proven themselves in Tunisia, would grow into the army that would help liberate their homeland. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. The Axis aura of invincibility, already damaged at Stalingrad and El Alamein, was shattered completely. The Wehrmacht could be beaten, and beaten decisively. The soft Americans had proven they could fight. The Allied coalition, despite its problems, had shown it could win. As the prison ships carrying Axis soldiers departed North African ports, many of the captives took a last look at the continent where they had fought so hard and lost so much. Hans von Luck, who would spend years in captivity, later wrote, "We had fought a good fight against overwhelming odds, but in Tunisia we learned that courage alone was not enough. The age of heroic warfare was ending. The age of industrial warfare had begun, and in that kind of war, the Allies were supreme. The battlefields of Tunisia would quickly return to peace. Farmers would plough fields where tanks had burned. Children would play in abandoned trenches. The scars of war would fade, covered by time and nature. But the lessons learned, the reputations made and lost, the experience gained, these would shape the rest of World War II. Tunisia had been what Churchill called it, not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. The long road to Berlin and Tokyo still lay ahead, but after Tunisia, the outcome was no longer seriously in doubt. The Allies had learned how to win, and the Axis had begun the inexorable slide toward defeat. In the mountains and deserts of Tunisia, the tide of the Second World War had turned decisively, written in the blood of soldiers from a dozen nations who had met in this ancient land to decide the fate of the modern world.